All right, Yitz, wonderful to see you as always. I am so excited for this conversation. I have, we have known each other a long time, 25 years at least. And for most of that time, I think when we first met, you were starting to teach The Triumph of Life, I think was in that study group in New York. And the whole time that I've known you, and my scholarly work has been about you, I've known this book has been gestating and wanting to come out in various forms. And so I'm just, first of all, so happy and delighted for you that it's finally happening and the book is finally here. And I'm grateful for you for the time today that we can talk about it, and you can tell our listeners and viewers in our audience a lot more about this book. So welcome, and we're really glad to have you here.
Thank you very much. And part of my self-image or self-ego has always been that I identify talent early. And so I've always been using you as a case study. I was starting the book, but when I met you for the first time, I was starting to think about the book. But from the day one, really was impressed. Of course, you did a thesis on me, so I can't say it was a casual awareness, but I was struck by the talent, and I congratulate the Institute for having the luck and the wisdom to get you to work for them. But I'm happy they have such a good leadership, because we need spirituality. Anyway, that's a free commercial.
Well, we will thank you. Thank you. That's very kind. And just editorial note, the doctorate came many years later. So we were well into our relationship. But so I want to begin by saying, or asking you, you've taught many, many thousands of people over 6+ decades now in American Jewish public life. I think that in reading the book, for people who know you will probably recognize teachings that they've heard before, and others may be introduced to your Torah through this book. I'm curious who you have in mind as the intended audience, and what do you hope they come away from their encounter with the book?
That's a very perspicacious question. Josh, when you say who was it intended for, I'll tell you why. Of course, I thought about the book for a long time, and there is stuff in there that I thought about for decades. But when I retired, which is 2009, I said, well, this is my chance. I've always found writing hard to do because of all the administrative responsibilities. So I said, well, here's my chance finally. And I started to write the book, or at least it was a book on the themes and on the major issues that are raised in Triumph of Life. And it was a monster text. By 2014, I finished it. It was 450,000 words, which is close to 1,000 pages. But, and that's the catch, when I looked at it, I said, this is not the book that I wanted to write. Meaning what? It was academic, it was more scholarly, it was more theoretical, and a few times along the way I stopped to say, well, this is what scholars argue about, and this is the two sides, and it wasn't the book I wanted to write. I said I really wanted to write a book for what I consider to be my primary audience, which is lay people, and particularly intelligent lay people, but also, in effect, the rank and file of Jewry. I've always felt these ideas are not meant to be just theology. They're meant to be, as the book turned out to be, a narrative that can guide or inspire, whatever word you want to use, the lay people in their daily living. So I said, it'll take another 2 or 3 years to edit this book. I put it aside, and I decided to write what is now The Triumph of Life, this book. So again, I didn't think this is 2014. I didn't think it would take 10 years. It actually took 8 years. And then my publisher told me they don't publish anything longer than 120,000 words. And I had 200,000 words. So it took 2 years to get it cut. I wasn't that happy about it. But the main point is that in the end, the book that I wrote is the book that I wanted to write, which is as I say, not just an intellectual exercise, it was an attempt to offer a comprehensive theology of the Jewish tradition, a comprehensive interpretation of the whole shebang. So it's not a modest goal, but it wouldn't have been that way, but for the fact that I was willing to start over again. So I hope it will. In fact, of course, it lands now at a time when, unlike most of these years, Judaism under attack, Israel's under attack. There's been a public relations real cost and setbacks in respect and acceptance and toxic almost hostility to Zionism. So it's coming out at a different time, but nevertheless, this is my hope that it will speak to the widest spectrum of the Jewish people. In other words, I've always felt I'm not just here to express or confirm the committed and the most committed. I'm trying to express something that reflects the experience and the authentic feelings and needs of a wide range of Jews, including Jews who are semi or partially unaffiliated, who are willing to get involved with the Jewish people.
So one of the things that struck me in reading it is your very thoroughgoing dialectical thinking, which is
on the other hand, you should. Okay,
that's right, but maybe not. And that's always been a hallmark of you, both I think in your writing, in your teaching, and in your person. You always raise multiple points of view. You articulate objections to your own arguments, and it's really one of the things that makes you most remarkable, and is kind of and is a signature, I think, of you. And it's also very much, I think, part of your pluralism, right? You're such a champion of pluralism, which you write about in the book. The Achilles heel of that approach is sometimes, and we've talked about this, is it can sometimes feel like you're telling everybody what they want to hear, and that because everyone can recognize themselves in your teaching, and you've taught me and many others the advice that you want to be about 15% ahead. If you're
maximum
right, if you're only 10%, you're probably not doing enough, and if you're 20%, you're a kook, and nobody will listen to you. So you want whatever that right zone is, right? But so I think this is all related. And so what I wanted to ask you is, as you just alluded to, we live in a time right now when polarization is really high, when there are seemingly existential issues in front of us. And how do you personally experience taking a stand while also acknowledging that I could be wrong? Maybe this isn't right.
It's a fair question. I'll start again by saying the dialectic is not just a trick. My feeling about ideas in general, and of course it is connected to the understanding of pluralism. All ideas, I think, have a range of effectiveness, a range of meaning, a range of application. And the truth is, even good ideas or bad ideas, but even good ideas don't always work, or not always correct, or don't always have a positive effect over the whole range. So once, sort of jokingly suggested, it's not joking, but I sort of try and express the idea that whenever you publish an idea, you should publish by its side. This idea is true over the following 25%. This idea is toxic or between 60 and 70, and so on. It's like when you bought a hi-fi in those days, they would tell you it gives you perfect pitch over the following megahertzes, but it starts to screech or skew when you go beyond the below. But I mean that seriously. In other words, so part of the dialectic is a lot of very, very good ideas work, but only over a certain amount. And when they get past that amount, they become even negative or destructive sometimes. Universalism is a good example. Universalism, which I'm committed to, and one of the main points of the book is that every human being is in the image of God, and it's not just a Jewish in-group morality and so on. Nevertheless, universalism, if you push it to the absolute limit, is homogenization. It obliterates or destroys legitimate and positive particular cultures and so on. So the dialectic is not just a kind of a tactic or a useful, it is really fundamental to keep the idea itself accurate and constructive and authentic. So that's part of the dialectic. I never thought it was a way of just simply, you're right, telling everyone what they hear. I will confess that many times I still do look for ideas that have this power to be heard over a wider range, and in which at different points on the spectrum you will hear it, but you'll hear it your way, which may be different than the guy next to you or the person one over from your particular spectrum. So yeah, but I don't think it was a way of avoiding clear moral clarity. I think not always present, but when it is present, I think it's essential to say it. And so I hope that the dialectic was not just a way of letting people hear what they wanted to hear, but also nuancing, shading, and for that matter, opening them up to multiple perspectives at the same time. Now, the truth is this kind of approach, there are good times, good contexts and bad contexts, and the polarization is certainly a negative in terms of acceptability or sometimes even credibility. And yes, so there were people who all along either dismissed it as too far, going too far, or ignored the modification dialectic in order to convict me of what they consider to be heretical or excessive statements. So my answer to that is, again, I gladly try to shift my tactics and language to fit into the times, but only to a very limited extent. And at some point when it compromises what you are or what you stand for, you don't do that. So all you can do is try to be steadfast and get through this. I hope the polarization will eventually burn out and overextend itself, and there will be greater willingness to hear the nuanced and the complicated. So that's about where I think I am now. And I nevertheless, even in the most dialectical moment, I think most people have a pretty clear idea of where I stand, at least on most of the major issues that we're dealing with right now.
Well, so I actually want to, for that, we'll come back in a moment to, I want to talk about holy secularity, but
let me break it just a second. It's another way of saying that pluralism is not relativism. And that was an issue. It remains an issue, but I think it's because they don't understand pluralism, particularly in the Orthodox community. Many people said once you admit there's multiple possibilities, that's relativism, and you have given up the sanctity and the authority of the tradition. I don't think so. So that's again back to the same issue. When you say an idea, but you say its limits, and you even criticize it, and it needs correction, does that mean you're disowning or betraying or rejecting? I think not. I think pluralism it's not as stable and it's not as fixed as absolute or relative for that matter, but it is, I think, a legitimate and important structure of meaning and understanding. Sorry, but
no. Well, because I want to go further on that. One of the places where you were most forceful and maybe least dialectical, you have a discussion of Messianism, and you come out saying, you yourself are still, a Messianist. I think, in fact, you quoted one of your earliest talks. I think your talk to Yavne in 1962, I think, right, was one of the earliest things where you talked about, and at that point you were not yet 30 years old, but you were sort of shrying against the world that how come we can't recognize we're living in a messianic era, right? The Mashiach's walking around and we don't even notice it. That'll bring us to holy secularity in a minute, but clearly post 1967 and onward, and now in this moment, there has developed a kind of messianism, a religious nationalist, ethno-nationalist, ethno-nationalist messianism on the Jewish religious right, which at this point is, in the government of Israel. And it was one of the places I was really struck where you didn't pull your punches. I mean, you were very clear. Um, and so I wanna ask you, to me, that pulled back to roots of debates you had with Mayor Kahana in the 1980s in Riverdale. Um, and so I'm thinking about today we are witnessing violence that is committed by um, some of these religious Zionist Messianists and their supporters. Huara, a couple of years ago was the most flagrant example, but there have been horrible examples really recently of attacks in the West Bank against Arabs. And I want to invite you to talk about why you see the behavior and the worldview of that brand of messianism as wrong and even dangerous. I mean, this is outside the bounds of your pluralism.
It's again a good question. It's interesting. David Hartman, who was really a dear friend and probably the closest to me spiritually, intellectually, and we carried on a conversation, even though after he made Aliyah for 30 more years, we would meet regularly and I would talk about it. Anyway, I was an unrepentant messianist, and we had one of the conversations. I remember one year, and I was talking about it. And of course, the book makes a major point about this. It may be, I hope it doesn't sound cute. My argument is that that's what Tikkun Olam is all about. The Messianist vision, the Jewish Messianist vision, which I think is the second most important influence it's had in world history. In other words, if God and ethical monotheism is the first influence, the second is not to accept the status quo and to literally try to totally transform the world, Jewish language, into a Gan Eden, into a paradise for life. I talk about it in the book, but so Messianism is, I remained unrepentantly committed to that idea. And Hartman said to me, I have personally I decided I have no choice but to reject it. I said, reject it? It's pretty central. He says, no, I reject it. He says, it's, you can afford the luxury of being in favor of Messianism because you're living in America. He said, I'm living in Israel. There are crazies out here who take it literally. And based on that, they're pushing all kinds of dangerous and deadly and destructive policies. I decided that there's no choice, but you have to repudiate the whole idea because it's like giving a weapon or a powerful, gun to a person who is a, pyromaniac, a killer, and you can't do that anymore. So I said, sorry, one of my old weaknesses, I like to have my cake and eat it too. I really believe this incentive, this push for perfection and for redemption of the world is the great engine of the religion and of the tradition. I don't want to give it up. I want to have my cake too. I want to have a covenantal messianism. The covenantal messianism, at the time I didn't have the three-stage, we'll talk about that idea, is one that accepts the covenant, and one of the most important things of the covenant is limits, that you can only transform the world totally, but only one step at a time, incrementally, responsibly, that to do so you cannot resort to coercion and to try to smash all the people standing in your way. That's an important difference between Judaism and other utopian visions, which have been very destructive in the last 200 years. So in effect, I'm saying Messianism is another example of a good idea, great idea. Maybe I'm more angry and rejecting of these types because it's a good idea, which I'm deeply committed to. And so it gives me the willies kind of to see how it can be misused. Now, what I mean by misuse? Well, the main misuse is that in the name of the Messianic Messiah, in other words, one who has supernatural powers, meaning God is the one who is making it happen, and God will cover any deficit that we have. God will make up for any imbalance between our forces and the other side. So it becomes a tool, of writing checks that you have no coverage for. And when they bounce, will have tremendously negative effects. I mean, the attempt to seize and suppress and crush the Palestinians in itself is morally bad, but it's also, in terms of allied and support, international acceptance, very destructive. to allow violence and illegal and behaviors of all sorts compounds that in a terrible way. And of course, it grows and it comes associated with, yes, Meir Kahana's vision of Jewish supremacy and after the Holocaust, that was his abuse of an important idea. We both shared the belief, and I gave him credit. He was one of the first to grasp that after the Holocaust, it's transformative, and you have to rethink all your policies. But he then showed me that even this idea, which I thought should lead to Jews making sure we never repeat the abuse of power that was the Holocaust, that Jews understand the limits of an even modernity and so on. Instead of seeing it that way, he used it as a kind of a rationale or justification for abuse and violence. And that eventually led to the break between us. But again, the tragedy, the famous line from Julius Caesar, the good that men, the evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones. Well, the evil of Meir Kahana lived after him in the form of Ben Gvir and other such disciples who I never dreamt would come to power. They were, of course, totally illegitimate and unaccepted. When Kahana got into the Knesset, Begin and Shamir used to walk out when he would speak because they show that he's not legitimate. I blame Netanyahu. I think it's one of the worst. He's done a lot of bad things to stay in power, but this is one of the worst. In order to legitimate them in the hope that their votes would enable him to remain prime minister. And then because they were legitimate, they got an electoral bounce. And then because he could get no other coalition, give them power, influence. There's been a catastrophic role. Israel has failed to express the moral regret, grief, suffering that it feels because of innocent or civilian casualties. They didn't express that. Israel started to help the Palestinians with food aid because they saw that hunger is coming, but they didn't say it because he was afraid that if he says it, that Ben Gvir or Smotrich will condemn him or reject him. So Israel has A, done the wrong things or allowed wrong things to be done, or B, delayed saying the right things and doing the right things because of these people. So again, it's not just that I intellectually think they're wrong. And to me, that's one of the major lessons of Jewish history, and certainly after the Holocaust, that the idea that God is going to do it for you and do miracles that human effort can't do, it's totally wrong. I argue in the book that the rabbis, that is true of the biblical period, but the rabbis moved away from it and said it by their time already. God doesn't operate that way in history. So to take on destructive, hostile, racist, whatever you can name it, views, overreaching and dangerous for the people who carry them out, to take them on in the name of God, so I really do feel, as I say, I'm not treating this maybe as calmly and as coolly as I should, but I felt particularly so because here's a good idea being twisted and turned into a dangerous weapon against other people and undermining the state of Israel. So yes, maybe it's a little harsh, but I think that sometimes you have to stop. The only way you can stop evil people. The bad news is it didn't stop the evil people. I regret to say that probably the religious Zionist community in Israel, that probably a majority are closer to Ben Gvir's views and to my views, but I'm not going to give in on that. I think it behooves everybody, and certainly religious Zionists, to stand up and say that is a vicious and twisted version of the tradition. And it's there in the tradition, but it should be compromised, it should be eliminated, it should be restricted and not broadcast and built on. So that's where we are with that.
So thank you. I wanna shift over to the idea of holy secularity. You use some different terminology for it in the book, but that's a term that you've used in the past, and is very significant, I think, both in your thinking and in the book. One of the places where you sort of most developed it, I mean, I think that this book is actually your fullest sort of systematic treatment is one of the places where I think you have some new things, some real chidushim, some new things to say here. You first really talked about it in the notion of the third era, right? That there was the biblical era, the rabbinic era, and now you termed, actually this also was new, you termed the third era now the lay era. I want to hear more about that. But in this book, you've really developed the idea of this total tzimtzum, right? This total self retraction, contraction of the divine. And for the first time that I was aware of, you actually brought in a Hasidic thinker. You brought in the Piazetzner, Kavanah Kalman Shapira. And then, but you also wrote very movingly at the very beginning of the last chapter. Actually, maybe I'll even just read this. At the very beginning of the final chapter, you write very movingly. In the third era, as God's tzimtzum calls on humans to take full responsibility for the covenant in partnership with the divine role transforms as well. You quote Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the deity is no longer the God of the gaps to whom humans turn out of insufficiency or to explain the inexplicable. Instead, God is the Lord to whom one turns out of strength, common cause, and love. And then you say, despite this era's tzimtzum, God is totally with each individual in every moment and place of life. Loving people, God shares joy and expands it exponentially. God elevates our spirits from the depths, raising the poor and moderating the mighty. God absorbs pain, making it more bearable. This closest sustains us. Though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for God is with me. And so this felt like some new terrain for you, or at least a new articulation of it. And I want to invite you to elaborate on it more. And maybe the way to think about that is, you know, this notion of holy secularity that you developed 40 or more years ago, you know, was the idea that God is seemingly totally concealed, but actually God is more present. The divine is more present and active in the world than ever, but we just have to sort of attune ourselves to it, to find, to see, to hear, to be aware of it. How is that idea? What did it mean to you 40 years ago? and how has that developed in the decades since? What does it mean now to you in the book?
Well, there are probably two parts to that. And first, I thank you. You got it very accurately. So I probably should stop here and say, I agree with what you said, and we'll leave it at that. One of the main ideas of the stages, and we'll talk about, I presume, about the stages of the covenant and of Jewish divine, human and divine interaction, is that there are many ways of describing it. One is the divine is almost electrifying. Literally, it's almost explosive and nuclear fission kind of in the first era. It is so powerful and so dominant that you can't get close. And literally, if you see God or if you get close, you will die. If you touch the ark, in which the divine messages, you will drop dead, which is an actual event, you know, in the book of prophets. But, and this is part of my claim, as we go through history, the divine presents in a dynamic and transformative fashion. And I think that's the rabbi's main insight. In the period when God is so all-powerful and all-dominant and so electric, the answer is you can go see the divine in a very limited number of places. Now, yes, it says in Ezekiel, God is everywhere, or in Isaiah, Maloch La'aretz Kvodo, but now the world is full of God's glory. Nevertheless, the intensity, God is literally visible, invisible miracles and so on. But that intensity means you can't get close and you can't see it in many places. What the rabbis say is that the divine, this is my argument, the rabbis say that God tzimtzum self-limitation, voluntary loving self-limitation, not to abandon us, and that's the confusion. Since God becomes hidden, people think, well, maybe God has left us. Or you have the classic idea of Hester Punim, God hides from us as a form of punishment. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the divine self voluntarily limiting, hiding, tuning down the voltage to come closer. In fact, to me, what captures it is that the word Shekhinah, it's not present in the word Shekhinah itself. The God's Mishkan, God is coming closer, is present, but that God presents a Shekhinah as a close, low, low electric, low voltage, loving, feminine, forgive that stereotype, but that's the image.
Mhm.
You have Shekhinah all over the rabbinic literature. And again, God is present, therefore, not just in the temple or in moments of such high visibility. God is present, well, in your kitchen, where you're cooking kosher rather than bringing a sacrifice in the temple, which is no longer available. So God is closer in your bedroom. Again, the Talmud's language here, when a man and woman make love in a proper spirit and in the proper mutual respect and their judgment and love, the Shekhinah is present. So the Shekhinah is present when you sit at the table and talk Torah. The Shekhinah is present when you visit the sick, when you express loving kindness by comforting the afflicted and visiting the mourners. So it's already a major transformation in which God comes closer, but again, not to abandon us, not becomes more hidden, in order to call humans to more responsibility. This is the age of Torah Shema Peh. This is the age where, if you want to know what God is saying, God will no longer speak from heaven. God will no longer send you a prophet. This is the word of the Lord exactly. Human beings, in this case rabbis, have to study and listen to the past record and use their brain to apply it to the present moment. What does God want of you? The answer is, two rabbis disagree. No, the answer is that it's a challenge, and it's a human role in interpreting it. Now I'm saying the logic of that extension is what I call holy secularity. Just as the shift to God's hiddenness meant humans had a greater role, the religious leadership in the first phase was visible, it was genetic, that is to say, elected by God, priests or prophets designated by God. In the second phase, it's an achieved leadership. Anybody who learns, anybody who studies Torah, anybody who can use their brain to understand and analyze and apply Torah is eligible to become a rabbi. I said anybody, not quite, at least all males were able to do that. Now, that's a direction. And so my argument was, in this phase, the halakha, the presence of God's holiness, spreads to many more areas, to the kitchen, to the bedroom, to the street, to the workplace. This is the direction. And again, I've come to see that's what God wants, because God wants humans to have both initiative, freedom, responsibility, but also to be in partnership. The third stage, and this is the stage I'm arguing we're in, God is totally hidden, but that's the paradox. The more hidden is, the more God is present. So my argument is, if God is totally hidden, then God is totally present. And that means there isn't a place in the world, not the workplace, not the secular entertainment, not sports, you name it, wherever you would think this is a secular activity, it's not secular. God is present, but of course it depends, again, how you attune to it, how you connect to it. So my argument in this case was, already 40 years ago, holy secularity meant this is the frontier, just as the frontier when rabbinic times was to extend holiness, ritual as a statement of holiness. And in this book, I'm arguing ritual is a statement of holiness, but holiness is a statement of life. Holiness is the maximization of life. Come back to that if you want to. But so given that, what the book has done and developed further from before is that the more secular, the more God is present, but the more the challenge, because we don't have inherited ways. When the rabbis said God is present in new places, they helped us find it. For example, blessings, a bracha over fruit. When you ate the apple, we wouldn't think of God's presence. Well, no. The blessing said to you, God is present in this apple. First of all, God created the tree. God created the animal, the animal that you're about to eat. God created the bush that which this fruit grew. And you should be aware of the creative power and the presence of God as you eat this apple. And so they helped us with their blessings, see many things that we wouldn't have seen if in the biblical period. So my argument again is that's what we have to do in the present period. And accept, and this is a catch, The holy secularity means, I'll give a concrete example. In my judgment, holiness is intensity of life. The deeper the life, the deeper the intensity of it, therefore the degree of the holiness. And that means the more the divine is present, except that you have to uncover it. So how do you uncover it? So part of it is just becoming attuned to it. I think of the doctor again. In my vision of the third era, the doctor does not pray for God to zap this cancer. What the doctor does, that's the example you cited in the book too. What the doctor does is said, God guide me, God inspire me, guide my mind to analyze and discover this particular chemical, which can cancel or kill the cancerous cell. So it's a very different kind of God's role. But, and I come back to this, but when the doctor, having discovered this power and applies it to this human being, this image of God, to save their life, to restore their health, in that moment, the doctor sees, if they're done right, the doctor sees himself or herself as the agent, as the representative, as the person inspired by God, and therefore, at that moment, feels that accompaniment on the partner on the one hand, and on the other hand, feels the human in front of them as the equal, unique image of God. And therefore, and at that moment, I think the doctor, if the doctor is open, they will discover where I see a human being, particularly a human being in need. There, and I see them in all their divinity of image. I see the God and I feel the presence of God as never before. Now, how do we help the doctor to see that? So I said in the book, and this is what the Institute of Jewish Spirituality have been saying for a long time, maybe it took me time to catch up. If you don't have a blessing for it. So my wife has argued, we should make more blessings. One of my favorite lines from her joke was that, giving birth, is there a moment when one feels more like a partner, the presence of God? We're all partners in creating life. This is the miraculous divine action of creating life. She said, you know what? There should be a blessing for giving birth. Then she stopped and said, well, if the rabbis could get pregnant and give birth, we'd have one humdinger of a bracha. Unfortunately, they're not. And as you know, the rabbinic halacha is somewhat androcentric and has been somewhat neglectful of the woman's role. So
well,
yes,
and as women have entered, I want to say, as women have entered in the last 50 years, clergy leadership, there has been an efflorescence of new ritual, right? That's also come along with it.
And that's exactly right. And what's more, that's one of the things I most admire and love in Blue, is that she saw this early and she understood that the woman's condition as a second-class citizen, or as one who not a full citizen, you don't count in the minyan, or who is not capable of studying advanced rabbinic literature, that this was a byproduct of the historic and the cultural background. But if it says in the Torah that women and men are equally image of God, that this is a capacity. And she looked around and said, they're showing it already in the secular culture. Why don't we give them a chance to show it in the religious culture? And of course, that's exactly what's happening. So to come back to the holy secularity, one of the ways in which it expands, again, is just like the leadership went from genetic and limited to achieved and much broader. In this phase, I believe it includes men and women who can achieve it equally and who can play these different roles of leadership in God's presence. So the main point of holy secularity is quite simply that God is not absent. We're not living in a world. This is what is misled. And by the way, this is a good example of a good idea, how it can lead to bad results. The modern call for humans to take power and overcome the enemies of life, poverty and hunger and sickness, these are all the messianic dreams. And modernity said, you can do it if you will take power in science and medicine, in business, in democracy, in politics. You can, it was right. Now, what happens when you take a good idea and you push it too far? The fact that God was not visible, not proclaiming God's presence, led a lot of people to say, there is no God, I'm in charge, I'm the master of the universe. And that attitude, that psychology, then took the very good things, increased productivity, and turned it into global warming, into species destruction, into all kinds of abuses of nature and loss of limits. So that's exactly the point we're trying to make, that holy secularity means the combination, taking all the power and more, because I believe our ability to increase life has not yet been fully maximized, to take all that power, but to keep it with a sense of reverence and holiness, namely that it's the expression of a life grounded in God, that God is my partner if I understand that and act accordingly and listen and be guided by it. And this combination of holy secularity, to me, is the frontier of religion. It's also the frontier of human culture and human dignity, because a secularity that without holiness, without any sense of partnership, accountability, a higher authority, goes out of control. The religion, in the same way, it goes out of control if there's no limit and there's no responsibility. So I think, to me, that's the frontier, the holy secularity. Now, you did ask a second question, which is, am I more into God, particularly quoting Shapiro? Well, of course, one reason I turned to him is because it captured for me, in fact, it's not even articulated, it's almost unconscious. He is a classic traditional Jew, started in the beginning of the Holocaust, and you read his sermons saying we sinned, we must be punished for our sins and things of that, things which I believe were legitimately said in the biblical period, but are certainly no longer true as life goes on. And more important, in the Holocaust, it's outrageous. What possible sin could justify or could explain what kind of an evil, demonic, hateful God would burn children alive because their parents didn't keep kosher? I mean, one could go on the list and so on. Because their parents were Zionists. In any event, Shapiro, as he struggled, began to realize more and more that the answer, it's our sins, can't be the answer. And as he struggled even more and toward the end of his, unfortunately, tragically cut short life, he began to talk about God's suffering and God being with them. And to me, that's the model that we were talking about now. Now, why didn't I talk about God so much for the previous 30, 40 years? Well, I'll say in part because of the Holocaust. That it was a very devastating religiously experience for me. And while there was a period, and there was, freely confessed, there were days or periods in my life when God simply, I couldn't believe in God. I couldn't feel the presence, to put it that way. You should not believe it, you should feel the presence. Again, when you read some of the accounts, particularly, as I said, to me, that account of burning children alive, that God could stand by and allow it to happen. I couldn't feel that God would have done that. So I only felt there is no God or no presence that I could detect. So it was very important for me, very important. And again, it didn't happen overnight. So the truth is, much of those 30 years or 40 years before this book, it was hard to talk about. I did speak about it because it wasn't important for me to. The first year or two, it was completely dialectical. Literally, there were days, weeks, when I believed in God, and there were days and weeks where I felt there was simply no presence and no reality to it. So it was very hard to live with, very painful. And for someone who had been born and raised religiously and who had had some very moving and important experiences of feeling God's presence, particularly in my yeshiva days in this Mussar yeshiva. So it was very hard. I've told that story. I had this experience 2 or 3 years after the first round, in which I put on my tefillin and tried to daven. And I said some days I just couldn't do it. But I suddenly, for the first time, it hit me, as pain and suffering that I'm reverberating to. What did God feel? Probably much more. It's an infinite consciousness. And it's true. It was an extraordinary experience, because I literally cried, but I felt for the first time, in a sense, God's pain. And I didn't forgive, but it made it much easier to think. But again, much easier to feel, much easier to, in some way, identify. So nevertheless, it wasn't a period where I felt very comfortable talking about the good moments, the moments of closeness and the moments of presence. Maybe I'm getting older, and that's one factor. They claim that people, as they get closer to their death, become more religiously willing. I don't think it's just that. I think, in part, it was a delayed reaction, having been immersed in death so much in the Holocaust, that I wanted to recapture the life, and it's in part the Israel, and my wife, children, a lot of reasons, a lot of experiences that pushed for the white life, for the life experience. And that comes back to, so in a way, now that the life experience has become more central, it's one of the main claims of the book, that it's the central goal of the tradition. I also feel in this moment, maybe I felt enough to be able to relax and concede or even affirm or express some of the feeling of what it means to be upheld by God, what it means to be. I'm not offering it as a solution or as a cure.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the points the Institute, the spirituality, is trying to make too.
Well, I want to say, interject that there's a part for folks who are reading the book, and if you're if you've come to IJS for this conversation, there's a wonderful part in the book in the last chapter, right towards the end. It's 312, where you talk about you're clearly racing. You're not racing, but you're hustling towards the end here to, like, there's a bunch of things that you want to say about, amazingly still, at age 91, you're still putting out ideas for, well, we should be doing this and this and this, and there's always the retreat center to build. That's your it's Ahab and his whale, that you've been dreaming about for 50 years. But you talk about Jewish leadership for the secular age, and you say the success of the response to the third Tzimtzum will depend on the community's ability to generate a leadership movement parallel to that of the rabbis in the first millennium. Rabbis today offer content, experiences, and personal models, but most have been trained with an understanding of God and Judaism drawn from the second stage of covenant. Many people feel dissonance when they hear rabbis speaking of God as a self-evident fact, or offering a more sacramental and authoritative worldview than they believe is plausible. Our new leaders must be able to speak of a God who is totally hidden or more subtly present, whose very presence can be experienced only as episodic, even uncertain. And you go through and talk about other modalities. I'll just read this part. Judaism must offer enriched understanding of the Jewish tradition and its treasury of past covenantal models. Traditional texts and models will not always be enough. For example, blessings may need to be supplemented or replaced by kavanot, intentional reflections, to uncover the holiness in new secular areas. Prayers may be extended by silence, meditation, music, and other means to reconnect to the hidden God. So, reading this, I said, "Oh, okay, there you go." Well, that's exactly what we've been all about. And it's interesting is that, when I tell the story of IJS, it's not often necessarily in response as a Shoah response. But of course, everything, post-Shoah is a Shoah response, whether it wants to be or not. And there is something really, significant about, in this era where people are hungry and looking for a Judaism they can believe in, and a relationship with the divine that they can believe in and relate to. I think that the people who founded IJS, 30 years ago, that were already in this movement, they were intuiting some very similar things, and the need for new ritual, the need for new training, the need for a new vocabulary of God and the divine, that's true to our experience. And so I wanted to thank you for that, for saying that. Folks, I'll be curious as folks read the book what they say about that. We're close to our time, and so I want to end with the following question, which is, not many people publish books, much less their magnum opus, at your age. Thank God you're 91 years old now, if my math is correct. And you alluded to this before, but what's your hope in publishing it now at this stage in your life?
It reminds me, I'll start with a joke. I used to stop the joke all the time, but you know, the fellow visits the business, he says, "Is this a nonprofit organization?" The guy says, "Yes, but we didn't plan it that way." Now, when you say publish at 91, the honest answer is I didn't plan to publish it at 91. I started this book, first of all, decades ago, but I started to write this book at the age of 77. That isn't exactly a kid, but it's not 91. So part of the answer is to publish an important work at a late stage in life was not planned, and it's not the ideal. But again, my answer is, as long as one is alive and as long as you have the energy and the desire to do that, I think, you know, you do. So the answer is I wanted to do it for a long time. And as I said, when I freed myself of administration and fundraising, I thought this is my chance to write it. It took much longer, I understand that. But that's number one. But again, I come back, the goal then was still, and it still was, I always felt, I say this in the book too, I love ideas. I spent my whole life sort of toying them, applying them, developing them, wrestling with them. So I certainly take ideas very seriously. Nevertheless, from the beginning, it's another whole story I won't have time for. To me, the test of an idea, that's one of the things I learned when I created CLAL. Sometimes ideas are brilliant, extraordinary in the ivory tower, but in real life, they don't work at all, or they're sometimes negative. Other ideas that are mediocre or think are mediocre, in the real world, they work beautifully. So my answer personally was that when I began to try to apply this theology and these ideas, to me, the test always was that they work in the real world, meaning do they inspire people to better living? Do they give people a sense of hope and direction and mission that they otherwise wouldn't have? So that was my goal in all the things that I wrote, but it was certainly clearer now. So when I wrote this book, my goal then was really not just to develop a theology of Judaism, but to offer a narrative that Jews could live by, a narrative that a wider range of Jews could find credible than we're finding the classic or traditional one, a narrative that would get people to go further, to try harder, or to go deeper and give more. So that was the goal from day one. And I also came to feel, I still do, that we're living in the heroic age of the Jewish people. It's a heroic age because we have never been as accepted and have as much power. So the heroism is to control that power correctly. It's also a heroic age because we've now had this outburst of hostility and degradation and persecution and even existential threatening. So it's heroic that Jews have not panicked and run away. They stood up. In the post-October 7th, what struck me again is that the evidence is the same thing that I experienced in dealing with the Holocaust. You think that after such an experience, people would run from being Jewish. I was tremendously moved by how many people went the other way, said, I'm not going to run away. I'm going to step up and stand for this. So that is a major part of why the book ended up that way. I also say that there were things I had not said, which I said, this is my last chance to say them, so I better say them. For example, the treatment of LGBTQ, which again, the more moderate, the more responsible modern Orthodox rabbis are starting to say we're kind and we have to be kind to them and not be hostile and treat them as, I think, as I argue in the book, on the contrary, this is a matter of, now that we know scientifically that in fact, this is not a perversion, this is a normal, albeit minority part of the sexual spectrum, that these people feel a genuine attraction to same sex in a way they don't to the opposite sex, then it's such sexuality is not only natural, it should be guided and judged by the same criteria that we try to apply to heterosexuality. In other words, it should be based on relationship. It should be based on faithfulness, monogamy, so to speak. It should be based on family and openness to family. Well, by that criteria, the homosexual gay marriage movement is a very significant positive. Anyway, so in the book, I wanted to put things like that, which I knew, but 10, 15 years ago, when I first concluded that way, I felt it's beyond 15% ahead of my community. And as it was, I was in trouble with the community, particularly not with the Jewish people, but with the Orthodox community, because pluralism was 15% and more ahead. So I held back. So I felt this is a book I'm not going to hold back anymore because if I don't say it now, I'll never say it. And then I wanted to make some corrections. The most important correction in the whole book. I stand behind and I'm proud. I wrote this essay called Voluntary Covenant. But Voluntary Covenant said that after the Holocaust and the Jewish suffering and the mass murder, that God has no right to command the Jewish people. Quoting Elie Wiesel, God gave us a mission, that's fine. But it should have told us, full disclosure, that it was a suicide mission. So my answer was, if you're asking people to go on a suicide, you can ask them. Anybody with a heart, anybody with decency would not command to join a suicide mission, would ask you if you're willing to volunteer because it's an important cause. So basically my argument of voluntary, why is the covenant functioning? Why is the Jewish people more covenantal? Why is Israel being built on a greater scale? Why is the Jewish people more learned and more committed than ever before? So I assume it's voluntary, they volunteered. I'd like to now rephrase it in the book I have. It's because the covenant was always intended that way. That the covenant, in the first stage, God is the dominant force, God rewards and punishments, and that's the way people get into the covenant. After 1,000 years or more of living that way, the rabbis came along and said, well, people are at a more mature level now. At the more mature level, they don't need and they won't get the reward in this life. Schar b'chai alma leka, said the rabbis. The reward in this life doesn't exist. You see too many innocent suffering, too many wicked winning. So they said, world to come, that's where you'll get the reward and the straight now. But it seems to me, and this is my claim of the third stage, God always wanted us to grow up and do it not because we'll be rewarded in this life or the next life, but because it's the right thing. And because we love the vision of treating fellow human beings in a world that gives them equality and uniqueness and infinite value. We do it because we fall in love with God. And we fall in love with the Jewish people, which has carried on this mission through all these thousands of years and through all the suffering and all the achievements. And that's why I'm doing it. So I wanted to write this book to make clear that our commitment to the covenant is of free will and voluntary, but not because of disillusionment with God, because of grasping the opportunity to be partners with God, grasping the greatness and the vision and the excitement and the power of making this world into a true paradise for life and to overcoming the enemies of life. And to me, again, I want to stress that overcoming means that if you're a businessman, you can help overcome poverty, do God's work, do religious mission. If you're a social worker, you can help overcome inequality, discrimination, or sickness, mental sickness. If you're a doctor, you can help overcome sickness that cripples and hurts people's capacity, or mentally losing Alzheimer, losing their message. So my point only is that this is what I tried to do in the book, is to give people, call people to attention. Here's a moment of power and opportunity. Here's a moment of greatness that the whole people is trying to show. You can join it, you can lead it, you can contribute to it. So I hope 91 is not too late. I do have a couple more books in the back of my mind, and I want to work with them.
And we should remind folks that you also published, I think it's on the shelf behind you, a translation of Israel Salanter's Elie Wiesel, right, with foundational text of the Musar movement, and a lot of people I know who will be watching this are involved in Musar practices, and so want to, if they haven't already done, and you wrote that with Justin Pines, I believe, right? So want to really encourage.
I give him the credit.
Okay. Well, and also, and that was also one that I know you have been, working on and wanting to publish for a long time, and that's another conversation. But we need to stop here. We've actually we've filled up our time, and we could go longer as we always could. I hope that we get to see each other in person someday soon. I'm hoping to come to Israel in the next few months, and that I can come and visit. But I really want to just thank you, and thank you on behalf of everybody who's going to be watching this and listening to it, and thanking you on behalf of so many of your students, among whom I count myself, for this book and for the decades of Torah that preceded it and upon which it's built. And wish you many more years of creativity and giving us Torah to learn and think about and study.
Thank you very much, and may your spirituality flourish. Thank you.
Thank you.